There's a hierarchy in Iowa farm auctions. At the top, you've got the big green iron. John Deere always draws a crowd, always brings premium bids. Below that, you've got Case IH Red, respectable, proven. Then you've got New Holland Blue, sometimes a versatile, maybe a challenger if you're lucky. And at the bottom, sitting alone on the back lot like something nobody wanted to claim, you've got everything else. The orphans, the off-brands, the tractors that showed up because someone ran out of money or died without sons to take over. On April 12th, 2024, at the Marshall County Equipment Auction in Marshalltown, Iowa, a Massey Ferguson 8S280 sat exactly there. Backlot, no crowd, no buzz. And standing 20 feet away, laughing loud enough for half the auction to hear, was Vince Kellerman, corn and bean farmer from Gilman, 2,200 acres. Known for running the biggest iron he could finance, and known for having an opinion about everything, especially tractors he thought weren't worth his time. Vince looked at the Massey Ferguson, shook his head, and said to the three guys standing next to him, "Who the hell brings a Massey to an Iowa auction? This is deer country. That red thing's gonna sit there all day and maybe pull 15 cents on the dollar." One of the guys laughed. Another said, "Looks clean though." Vince said, "Clean doesn't pull. I wouldn't run that thing if they gave it to me." He said it loud. He wanted people to hear. Because Vince Kellerman didn't just farm, he performed. And the auction yard was his stage. By the end of that day, Vince would own that Massey Ferguson. Not because he wanted it, because he got backed into a corner by his own mouth and a bid war that spiraled faster than he expected. And 6 weeks later, that same tractor he mocked in front of half the county would outpull every piece of iron on his farm, save his planting season, and make him look like a fool in front of the same people who'd heard him talk. This is the story of a man who bet his reputation on brand loyalty and lost it to 300 horsepower of red iron he never saw coming. Vince Kellerman ran 2,200 acres outside Gilman, northeast of Marshalltown. Corn and soybeans on a 50-50 rotation. He'd taken over the operation from his father in 2006 and expanded it aggressively. He ran 6 tractors, all green, 3 8R series machines for primary work, 2 7R units for spraying and grain cart duty, 1 older 6R he kept for loader work and backup. Vince was a Deere loyalist, the way some men are loyal to a football team. It wasn't just preference, it was identity. He wore the hat, he had the jacket, his truck had a John Deere decal on the back window, and he made sure everyone knew that if it wasn't green, it wasn't serious. But by early 2024, Vince had a problem. His primary tillage tractor, an 8R 370 with 6,400 hours, was starting to struggle. The transmission was slipping under heavy load. The DEF system was regenerating more often than it should, and the fuel consumption had crept up from an average of 12.8 gallons per hour to over 14. Vince had taken it to his dealer twice. Both times they'd run diagnostics, cleared codes, and told him everything looked fine, but it didn't feel fine. The tractor wasn't pulling the way it used to, and with spring planting starting in less than 3 weeks, Vince needed power he could trust. He thought about trading it in, but the Deere dealer quoted him $198,000 on trade for a machine he'd paid $340,000 for in 2018. That was a $142,000 loss in 6 years. Vince couldn't stomach it. So he started looking at used iron. That's what brought him to the Marshall County auction on April 12th. He wasn't there to buy a Massey Ferguson. He was there to find a low-hour 8R, or maybe a clean Case IH Magnum he could pick up cheap and flip in a year. He'd done it before. Buy undervalued iron at auction, run it for a season, sell it private party for more than he paid. It was a side hustle that had worked twice already. The auction started at 9 a.m. Vince walked the lot early, checking hour meters and looking for hidden damage. He found 2 John Deere 8R tractors worth bidding on. One was a 2020 8R 340 with 4,100 hours. The other was a 2019 8R 310 with 5E200 hours. Both were priced to move. Vince figured he'd get one of them for under $220,000 and be home by lunch. Then he saw the Massey Ferguson. It was sitting on the back edge of the lot, away from the main lineup. A 2021 8S280, candy apple red with black trim, 280 horsepower, CVT transmission, The hour meter read 2,800 hours. It looked clean, no dents, no rust, fresh paint on the wheels. But it was a Massey Ferguson. And in Gilman, Iowa, Massey Ferguson was a punchline. Vince walked over to it with two of his neighbors, Gary Hoff and Tom Lindeman. Gary ran deer. Tom ran case. They all looked at the Massey like it had wandered onto the lot by mistake. Vince said, "What's a Massey doing at a Marshall County auction? This is corn and bean country. Nobody runs that European garbage out here." Tom said, "Looks like it's in good shape." Vince said, "Doesn't matter. You can paint a pig red. It's still a pig. That thing won't hold value. Parts are going to take 3 weeks to show up. And good luck finding a tech who knows how to work on it." Gary laughed and said, "You going to bid on it?" Vince said, "Hell no. I wouldn't run that thing if they gave it to me." A few people standing nearby heard him. One guy smirked. Another shook his head. Vince didn't care. He was playing to the crowd, and the crowd agreed with him. Massey Ferguson didn't belong in Iowa, not on a serious operation. The bidding started at 10:30 a.m. The two 8R tractors Vince wanted came up early. The 8R.340 opened at $180,000. Within 2 minutes, it hit $237,000. Vince dropped out at $225,000, too rich. The 8R310 opened at $160,000 and climbed to $214,000 before Vince even raised his hand. He was priced out. By 11 a.m., both Deere tractors were gone, sold to buyers who had deeper pockets or less sense. Vince was frustrated. He'd driven 40 miles to buy a tractor and had nothing to show for it. Then the auctioneer brought up the Massey Ferguson 8S.280. Opening bid, $140,000. Nobody moved. The auctioneer repeated it. $140,000 for a 2021 Massey Ferguson 8S with 2,800 hours. Clean machine, runs strong. Who's going to start me at $140,000? Silence. Vince looked around. The crowd was dead. Nobody wanted it. The auctioneer dropped the opening bid. $130,000. Do I hear $130,000? Still nothing. Gary nudged Vince and said, "You could probably steal that thing for $120,000. Vince said, "I don't want it." Gary said, "It's got low hours, clean machine. Even if you don't run it, you could flip it." Vince said, "To who? Nobody in Iowa wants a Massey Ferguson." But he was thinking, low hours, clean condition. If he could get it for $110,000 less, he could flip it to someone out of state. Maybe a guy in Kansas or Missouri who didn't care about brand as much as Iowa farmers did. It was a gamble, but it was a cheap gamble. The auctioneer dropped the bid again. $120,000. I need $120,000 to get this started. Vince raised his hand. The auctioneer pointed at him. "I've got $120,000. Do I hear $125,000? A man Vince didn't recognize, standing near the front, raised his hand. The auctioneer said, $25,000. Back to you, sir. He pointed at Vince. Vince hesitated, then raised his hand again. $130,000. The other bidder came back at $135,000. Vince thought about walking away, but people were watching. Gary and Tom were standing right next to him. He just spent 10 minutes telling everyone the Massey Ferguson was worthless. If he let someone else buy it for $135,000, he'd look like he didn't know what he was talking about. So he bid again, $140,000. The other bidder raised to $145,000. Vince raised to $150,000. The crowd started paying attention. Two guys fighting over a tractor nobody wanted 5 minutes ago. The other bidder went to $155,000. Vince went to $160,000. The auctioneer was grinning. This was turning into the kind of fight that made auctions fun. The other bidder paused, looked at the Massey Ferguson, looked at Vince, then shook his head and walked away. The auctioneer said, "Sold!" $160,000 to bidder 47. Vince's stomach dropped. He'd just bought a Massey Ferguson, the tractor he'd mocked 20 minutes earlier, for $160,000. Gary slapped him on the back and said, "Congrats, you just bought yourself a red tractor." Vince didn't say anything. He walked over to the auction office, signed the paperwork, and arranged transport. The Massey Ferguson would be delivered to his farm Monday morning. He drove home in silence, replaying the bid war in his head, trying to figure out how he'd gotten backed into buying a tractor he didn't want. His wife, Linda, was in the kitchen when he got home. She asked if he'd found a tractor. Vince said, "Yeah, I bought one." She asked what he got. He said, "A Massey Ferguson." She stopped what she was doing and looked at him. "You bought a Massey Ferguson? I thought you said you'd never run anything but deer." Vince said, "I got caught in a bid war. It's fine. I'll flip it in a month." Linda said, "How much?" Vince said, $160,000. She didn't say anything, but the look on her face said enough. The Massey Ferguson 8S.280 was delivered Monday morning at 7 a.m. The truck driver unloaded it in Vince's equipment yard and left. Vince stood next to it, staring at the red paint, feeling like he'd made a terrible mistake. He fired it up just to make sure it ran. The ATCO power engine turned over smooth, no smoke, no unusual sounds. He let it idle for a few minutes, then shut it down. He didn't hook it to anything. He didn't test it. He just wanted it gone. He called a farm equipment broker in Des Moines and asked if he could move a low-hour Massey Ferguson 8S. The broker said Massey's tough to move in Iowa, might take a while. Vince said, "How long?" The broker said, "Could be 2 months, maybe 3. Vince hung up. By mid-April, Vince's 8R370 was getting worse. The transmission was slipping so bad he couldn't pull his 12-row planter without losing speed in the turns. He called his Deere dealer and told them he needed it fixed now. They said they could get it in the shop by May 1st. Vince said, "That's 2 weeks away. I'm planning in 5 days. The service manager said, "We're backed up. Best I can do is May 1st. Vince said, "What am I supposed to use in the meantime?" The service manager said, "Rent something, or use one of your other tractors." Vince said, "My other tractors don't have the horsepower to pull a 12-row planter through 2,200 acres. The service manager didn't have an answer. Vince hung up and sat in his office, staring at the planting schedule on the wall. He had 5 days to get 1,100 acres of corn in the ground before the soil moisture window closed. After that, the forecast showed rain for a week. If he missed the window, he'd be planting wet, compacting the soil, and risking emergence problems that would cost him yield all season. He needed a tractor. And the only one sitting in his yard with enough horsepower was the Massey Ferguson he'd been trying to sell. He walked outside and looked at it. Still sitting where the truck had left it. Still red. Still wrong. But it had 280 horsepower and a CVT transmission that was supposed to handle heavy implements without shifting. Vince didn't want to use it, but he didn't have a choice. He hooked his 12-row Kinsey planter to the Massey Ferguson, set the CVT to auto mode, and drove it to the first field. The ground was firm but not hard. Perfect planting conditions. Vince had planted this field a dozen times with the 8R370. He knew how it pulled. He knew what to expect. He lowered the planter, engaged the row units, and throttled up. The Massey Ferguson bit into the load and started pulling. The CVT found its torque band immediately. No hesitation, no wheel slip. The tractor pulled the planter across the field at 5.8 miles per hour without straining. Vince had been running the 8R at 5.2 miles per hour in the same field. The Massey Ferguson was faster, and it felt smoother. He finished the first pass and made the turn at the headland. The Massey's turning radius was tighter than the Deere's. He didn't have to back up to clear the planter wings. He just swung it around in one motion and started the next pass. By the end of the first hour, Vince had covered 18 acres. That was 3 acres more than he used to cover in an hour with the 8R. He checked the fuel gauge. The Massey had burned half a tank less than the Deere would have at the same point. Vince didn't say anything, but he noticed. By the end of the first day, Vince had planted 110 acres. That was his best single-day planting total in 4 years. The Massey Ferguson had pulled flawlessly. No breakdowns, no slipping, no overheating, just steady, consistent power from sunrise to dark. Vince shut it down, climbed out of the cab, and stood next to it in the dim light. He didn't want to admit it. But the tractor he'd mocked at the auction had just outperformed the John Deere he'd been running for 6 years. The next morning, Vince's neighbor, Gary Hoff, stopped by. He saw the Massey Ferguson hooked to the planter and said, "You're actually using that thing?" Vince said, "My 8R's down. This is all I've got." Gary said, "How's it running?" Vince said, "Fine." Gary waited for more. Vince didn't give it, but Gary could see the fresh planter tracks across the field. He said, "Looks like you covered some ground yesterday." Vince said, 110 acres. Gary said, in one day, I did 87 yesterday with my 8-art 340. Vince said, this thing pulls faster. Gary looked at the Massey Ferguson like he was seeing it for the first time. He said, huh. Then he left. Word spread fast in small farming communities. By the end of the week, 3 other farmers had stopped by Vince's place to see the Massey Ferguson. One of them was Tom Lindeman, the guy who'd been at the auction. Tom said, I heard you're actually running that red tractor. Vince said, yeah. Tom said, how is it? Vince wanted to say it was a piece of junk, wanted to say he was counting the days until he could sell it, but he couldn't lie about what he'd seen. He said, it pulls better than my 8R, burns less fuel, turns tighter, faster. Tom said, you're serious. Vince said, I'm serious. Tom stood there for a minute, looking at the Massey Ferguson like it was some kind of trick. Then he said, I'll be damned. By the time Vince finished planting his corn, the Massey Ferguson 8S.280 had covered 1,100 acres in 8 days. 0 breakdowns, 0 delays, average planting speed 5.9 miles per hour, fuel consumption 10.4 gallons per hour. The 8R.370 in the same fields the previous year had averaged 5.1 miles per hour and burned 12.7 gallons per hour. The Massey Ferguson had saved Vince 2,530 gallons of diesel over the planting season. At $3.60 per gallon, that was $9,108 in fuel savings. Vince ran the numbers 3 times to make sure he wasn't missing something. He wasn't. The Massey Ferguson was cheaper to operate and faster in the field than the John Deere it had replaced. But the real test came in late May when Vince started his heavy tillage work. He hooked his 14-shank sunflower ripper to the Massey Ferguson and took it to a 200-acre field that needed deep work. The ground was compacted clay. Hard. The kind of soil that exposes a tractor's weaknesses. Vince had run the 8-art 370 through this field 2 years earlier and barely made 4 miles per hour. The tractor had struggled. Wheels had slipped. He'd had to reduce his depth just to keep moving. He set the Massey Ferguson's ripper to 16 inches deep and throttled up. The rear tires gripped. The CVT held the torque band. The tractor pulled through the compacted clay at 4.6 miles per hour without slipping. Vince couldn't believe it. He checked the drawbar sensor he'd mounted for testing. Peak pull force, 21,400 pounds. That was 1,800 pounds more than the 8R 370 had ever pulled in the same field. The Massey Ferguson wasn't just matching the Deere, it was outpulling it, by a margin that couldn't be explained away. Vince finished the field in 2 days. He parked the Massey Ferguson, climbed out, and stood there for a long time, staring at it. This was the tractor he'd called European garbage at the auction. The tractor he'd said he wouldn't run if they gave it to him. And it had just outperformed every piece of iron on his farm. He felt like an idiot. But more than that, he felt like he'd been lied to. Not by a person, by a brand, by a culture, by the idea that green was automatically better just because everyone said it was. In early June, Vince ran into Gary Hoff at the co-op. Gary asked how the Massey Ferguson was holding up. Vince said, "It's the best tractor I've ever owned." Gary laughed, thinking it was a joke. Vince said, "I'm not kidding. It pulls harder than my 8R, burns less fuel, runs quieter. I've put 600 hours on it in 2 months and haven't had a single issue." Gary stopped laughing. He said, "You're serious." Vince said, "Dead serious. I'm selling the 8R 370, keeping the Massey." Gary said, "What are you going to tell people?" Vince said, "The truth, that I was wrong." Vince listed the 8R 370 for sale in July. He was honest in the ad. Transmission issues, needs service, price to move. He sold it for $174,000 to a farmer in Minnesota who wanted to rebuild it. That was $24,000 less than the dealer had offered on trade. But Vince didn't care. He didn't need it anymore. The Massey Ferguson had replaced it. And by every metric that mattered, pulling power, fuel efficiency, operator comfort, the Massey Ferguson was better. By August, 3 farmers in Gilman had asked Vince about the Massey Ferguson. All of them were Deere operators. All of them had heard the story. The guy who mocked the Massey at an auction and then made it his primary tractor. One of them, a younger farmer named Kyle Brennan, came out to Vince's place and asked to see it run. Vince hooked it to his grain cart, pulled a full load across the field and let Kyle sit in the cab. Kyle climbed out and said, "That's smoother than my 8R.310. Vince said, "I know." Kyle said, "How much are these new?" Vince gave him the Massey Ferguson dealer's number. Kyle bought an 8S 245 in September, traded his 8R.310 straight across. He called Vince 2 weeks later and said, "You were right, this thing pulls like a monster." Vince said, "I told you." Kyle said, "My dear dealer's pissed." Vince said, "They'll get over it." By the end of 2024, Vince had put 1,400 hours on the Massey Ferguson 8S.280. 0 breakdowns, 0 unscheduled service, oil changes and filters. That's it. His annual fuel cost for primary tillage and planting dropped 22% compared to the previous year with the 8R.370. His cost per acre went from $164 to $128. On 2,200 acres, that was $79,200 in annual savings. The Massey Ferguson had paid for itself in operational efficiency in less than one season. But the bigger change was cultural. Vince stopped wearing the deer hat, stopped defending green iron in conversations at the co-op, stopped assuming brand loyalty meant anything when performance data proved otherwise. He didn't become a Massey Ferguson evangelist. He just became honest. And honesty in a community built on tradition felt like betrayal to some people. His old deer dealer stopped calling, stopped sending service reminders, stopped inviting him to customer appreciation events. Vince didn't care. He had a tractor that worked, and that was all that mattered. In March 2025, Vince went back to the Marshall County auction, not to buy, just to watch. The same auctioneer was there, the same crowd, and sitting on the lot was another Massey Ferguson, an 8S 265 with 3,100 hours. Vince stood near the back and watched the bidding. It opened at $150,000. Within 3 minutes, it hit $198,000. A farmer from Tama County bought it. After the sale, the guy walked over to Vince and said, "You're the guy who runs the 8S 280, right?" Vince said, "Yeah." The guy said, "I heard the story. That's why I bought this one." Vince said, "It's a good machine." The guy said, "It better be. I just pissed off my deer dealer." Vince smiled. He knew exactly how that felt. The Massey Ferguson 8S 280 is still Vince's primary tractor. It's got over 2,100 hours on it now. It still outpulls the John Deere it replaced, still burns less fuel, still runs quieter, and every time Vince fires it up, he thinks about the day he stood at the Marshall County auction and told everyone it was worthless. He'd been loud, confident, wrong, and the tractor proved it every single day. Gary Hoff bought a Massey Ferguson 7S 210 in April 2025. Didn't tell anyone until it showed up in his equipment yard. Tom Lindemann traded his Case IH Magnum for an 8S 245 2 months later. Neither of them made a big announcement. They just quietly switched. Because once you see a tractor outperform the iron you've trusted your whole life, brand loyalty stops being loyalty. It just becomes stubbornness. Vince still farms 2,200 acres, still runs mostly green equipment, but his primary pulling tractor is red, and he doesn't apologize for it anymore, because the dirt doesn't care what color the machine is. The crops don't know the difference between a CVT and a power shift. All that matters is whether the work gets done, and the Massey Ferguson gets it done better than anything else he's ever owned. That's the cost of mocking a tractor at an auction. And it's a hell of a lot more than $160,000.